Okay, let's see. I just need to get rid of something here. Okay.
Great. And so today we're having Mary James for our Physics and Astronomy Sea Change webinar, and we're going to learn about how to do better regarding hiring. And without further ado, Mary, take it over.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. So I'm going to share my screen. Second here. And 1 second to go to presenter view here. Okay, so today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a strategy that we've honed at Reed College over the last 9 years or so to increase our success in hiring faculty from diverse backgrounds, particularly the underrepresented minorities along racial and ethnic lines, so African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans. So first, what I'd like to say is we have an hour together, and normally I present this material in two-hour workshops. So this is really an overview of the paradigm rather than all the nuts and bolts. I'm happy to speak with anyone either right after the, I guess it's a webinar, so I can't speak to you right after the presentation, but I'll give you my contact information. If you'd like more information, please let me know. Okay, so first of all, what are the overarching themes? So the overarching themes are that we're talking about tenure-track searches, and the tenure-track searches are a 30-year investment on the part of the institution. So you are literally, if you hire a tenure-track faculty member this year and they're successful at your institution, they will be on the faculty until the year 2050 or 2055. So you are literally hiring the mid-century faculty now. This is the future of your institution. So rather than thinking of many places, the hiring protocols are the same if you're hiring a tenure-track faculty member, a one-year visitor, or even an adjunct. And so we decided that we needed an entirely new paradigm for conducting faculty searches, and particularly tenure-track searches. We also know that only faculty hire faculty. That is, the dean may have to approve the hire and that kind of thing, but if the faculty on the search committee and in the department aren't interested in the candidate, they're not going to get then they're not going to make it through the search process to be put forward to the dean. So only faculty hire faculty, so they need to understand and use methods critical to the success of the new paradigm. So it's really important that the faculty understand it and use it. So we begin with this concept that I love this quote: every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So I love this quote so much. I tried to find someone, a particular individual to whom to ascribe it, but I couldn't find that. What I did find was that this seems to have come out of the British healthcare system. And the problem that they were interested in was they had a healthcare system, and a patient was presented who was ill. And so they told the patient, they gave the patient a protocol to follow to get well. And it was perfect for the perfectly compliant patient. But what happened was patients couldn't be perfectly compliant, and therefore they didn't get better and they remained sick. And now the healthcare system blamed them for their illness because they weren't perfectly compliant with their treatment regimen. So instead of a system where ill people become well people, they had a system where ill people became ill people who were blamed for their illness. So they said, what we really wanted was that system where ill people became well people. What's wrong with our system that's not our outcomes? And what they found was that, so they had to look at the piece where they were expecting people to be perfectly compliant and ask the question, why can't people be perfectly compliant? And so if you or a loved one has ever had cancer and needed radiation therapy, you have to take radiation therapy for 30 to 20, somewhere between 20 and 40 days in a row. And when they tell you that you or your loved one is going to have this regimen, the first question they ask is, do you have transportation? Do you have childcare? Because they know that those are the reasons that people were not compliant in the past. And then they have an army of volunteers who will bring you and your child to the radiation clinic, and then take you home again. So that the chances of you being compliant go way, way up if your basic, if you have transportation and childcare to get you to those appointments. Okay, so the first part of our new paradigm is to ask ourselves, what is our system perfectly designed to do? And as we said in the last slide, if you want to know what your system is perfectly designed to do, look at your outcomes. So share with your faculty exactly what your current system has achieved. That is, if your faculty is 80%, 85% white, then your system is perfectly designed to achieve that outcome. When we show the faculty the statistics across the entire college for representation by racial and ethnic categories. And when we do this, we distinguish between faculty of color and faculty from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, which will use the abbreviation URM, because at many institutions, faculty that are Asian or Asian American are overrepresented as a percentage of the population. That's not a bad thing, that's a great thing, but if you put all faculty of color together, it can mask the underrepresentation of traditionally underrepresented groups. We also show the statistics by department and emphasize that making a hire in English does nothing to diversify the chemistry department. And so that individual departments need to think about their system. Okay. And we state that if we continue our current methods, you'll continue to achieve the same results. Okay, so we start, so at Reed, we have a 2-year process. Okay, the preparatory year and we call it the preparatory phase is the first year and the public phase is the second year. So you can't do a tenure track hire on 1 month's notice any more than you would build a building with 1 month's notice. You're making a long-term investment for the institution, and so planning is required. So in the beginning of that preparatory year, we work with the departments. Oh, I want to go back. I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, searches are so time-consuming, and now you want a 2-year process? As we'll see as we go along, you're not spending a lot of time in the first year. It's not time, but it's thinking through what you actually want to achieve with your next hire. Okay, so it's not 40 hours a week. It's maybe 4 hours a month, something like that you're going to invest. Okay, so first of all, it's really important that we understand our overall search goals. So these are our goals. So hiring for 2055 requires a new colleague who is 1, well-trained, 2, promising as a scholar teacher, 3, eager to work at your institution, and I'll come back to that, and 4, brings attributes that diversify and complement the department, program, and university's existing strengths along as many axes as possible. Okay. So notice that this is one of the goals of the search. It's not an add-on at the end. It's not something we do because we're nice, but rather for the institution to thrive, we can't clone ourselves. What I like to say is, don't replace Bob 1 with Bob 2. So Bob 1 was hired in 1980. The academic disciplines have evolved in the 40 years since then. And so we want to hire for 2050, not for 1980. So what are our strengths, and along what axes could we hire someone who complements those strengths rather than reproduces them? Okay. Attributes that diversify and complement our existing strengths include embodied diversity, curricular diversity, knowledge of and skill in inclusive pedagogical practice, and cultural fluency and cultural humility. Okay, so paradigm. How do we maximize these attributes in our hire? So maximizing a 30-year investment takes planning and follow-through. And so we have a 2 and sometimes more year process, the preparatory phase and the public phase, as I said. So what happens in the preparatory phase? So a department or program meets in the year prior to the year that they're launching a public search, and they begin by building a strategic plan. So they build a long-term strategic plan for the department or program. And the questions they need to answer are, what are the growth areas of study or modes of inquiry in your discipline? In many disciplines, the growth areas are the study of the texts, creative products, and lived experiences of historically marginalized peoples and groups. Okay, so by its very nature, the growth areas are the areas that have not been explored in the past. The department is asked to ask itself, who will you be educating in 10 years, in 20 years, as the college-going population becomes more and more racially and ethnically diverse. And I'm using race and ethnicity here as an example, but there are many other axes of diversity, including gender expression, sexual orientation, physical ability, mental health issues, etc. Okay, but in this long-term strategic plan, you're asking, who will you be educating in 10 years, 20 years? How will you meet the department and university's educational equity and anti-racism goals? And in what ways will your new hire help you to decolonize or recenter your curriculum away from a strictly Euro-American perspective toward a more global and global perspective? Okay, so after strategic planning comes tactical planning. So in this, you want to think about, okay, if we're interested in hiring someone who complements us rather than clones us, we need to think about emerging and interdisciplinary subfields. So what are the emerging subfields in our discipline? And also, what are the subfields, if you will, in the interstitial space between our discipline and other disciplines? So an example might be, if you're an English department and you could and you're interested in hiring someone in one of the areas you might be interested in is African American literature or African diaspora literature in English. But if you put in your job ad, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but if you put in your job ad needs requirements PhD in English, then you're going to leave out someone who may have studied literature in an African American studies program. Okay, so you need to think about those interdisciplinary subfields that might fit in your department but complement the existing strengths that you have. Think about stretching for a great candidate. So you may have something in mind. For instance, our chemistry department made a hire a few years ago and an incredible candidate presented themselves, a candidate from an underrepresented minority group who they thought was spectacular and has turned out to be spectacular. But they were in a subfield that was very close to someone else in the department. But that someone else was going to retire in about 3 to 5 years. So they decided they could have overlap in the time. Oh, no, it wasn't. Yeah, they could have overlap of subfields for a finite amount of time and fill in what they needed with sabbatical replacements. And then when the next search came, they could search for what they were originally searching for in this search. So they were able to think broadly and long-term to be able to hire this great candidate. And then think through the investments that you are going to make in your new colleague. So the point here is that if we want to hire someone who complements us, then by definition, they don't come in getting our institution in the ways that a clone would. So we need to think through our investments in this new colleague who's going to bring us so much. So how are we going to mentor this new colleague? And who is going to do that? And how are they going to get credit from the department, college, university for doing that work? Startup funds for the candidate, space, equipment, and then professional development opportunities are very important, both if they have professional development opportunities in the discipline, but also that they have, particularly if they're going to be, for instance, the only African American in the department, that they have professional development opportunities in which they can be among people who are in similar circumstances at similar institutions. Okay, then, and this is why you need the preparatory year. In the preparatory year, you build your candidate pool. So rather than getting approval for the position, throwing an ad out there for 3 weeks to 6 weeks, and then looking at a candidate pool and saying, oh, it's so too bad it's not diverse. Oh, well, on we go. We say in the year prior to search, it's our responsibility to build the candidates pool. It's not the candidate's responsibility to find us. So here are some myths to dispel. So of course, in the early days of of these search practices that I'm describing today, there was a lot of discussion of, oh, well, we can't hire anybody in our field because who's an underrepresented minority, because no underrepresented minorities are getting degrees. That's not true. In every field, underrepresented minorities are getting PhDs every year. Okay, so here are some myths to dispel. The Ivies will snatch all the really good faculty of color. Okay, I've always found this an intriguing argument because everyone on the Reed faculty does not teach in an Ivy, and they all think of themselves as really good. So if they're good enough for Reed, why wouldn't there be faculty of color that are, quote, good enough for Reed? So it's a bizarre argument. Okay, we are not competitive in pay. Okay, well, we all are at Reed with the pay that we're getting paid this supposedly not competitive amount of money. So the answer here must be that not everyone is motivated by the highest pay offer. There are other reasons that people go to and stay at institutions. And we had those other reasons since we're not making the most money ever offered by an academic institution. And there are people of color who have those same reasons. If people want pay, you got a PhD in anything, Google will hire you. But if you're interested in, if you're applying for an academic position, then you want an academic position. Another argument, we're in the wrong part of the country. Every school's in the wrong part of the country. If rural schools say, oh, we're not in a big city. Big city schools say, oh, our big city is so expensive, no one can come here for this pay. All those things are true. And there are all kinds of reasons that people live all over the country. Okay. And then everyone in our field knows to apply to every job opportunity. That's simply not true. And so we have to take it upon ourselves to find the candidates that we would like to see in our pool. Okay, so how do you go about building a diverse candidate pool? So we identify and make contact with potential BIPOC, candidates before the search begins. BIPAC is, I don't know why the I is small here, my mistake, Black, Indigenous, people of color, okay, before the search begins. So one of the wonderful things about beginning before the search begins is you don't have a job ad out there. So there's no such thing as treating candidates from being, for instance, treating candidates differentially. Okay, you don't have a search. You can build your pool differentially. You can take active steps to have a diverse pool. So we look at grad schools, and we look for people in grad school at the end of their time there, about to go on the market, postdocs. We ask colleagues who might be excellent candidates for our job, what conferences should we be attending, what are the professional society groups for underrepresented minorities, and what are the professional development pipeline programs for underrepresented minorities in our disciplines. And then as we actually, we work with the department. I worked for 8 years as the Dean for Institutional Diversity. So my job at that time, my office worked with the departments and said, you identify the grad schools and places where there might be postdocs who'd be interested in our job. And we hired undergraduates to actually scrape the websites of those grad schools and postdoctoral positions and look for promising candidates of color who we might contact. And then we contact those, and we ask each department to do between 20 and 50 contacts and to make an actual touch. So send an email to people and say, hi, I noticed your website. Your scholarship seems really interesting. Seems like you're interested in teaching. Maybe Reed College would be a great match for you. Love to have a conversation with you about your future plans. And if you're interested in small liberal arts college, I could give you some tips on applying to schools and making your cover letter and CV look most attractive to schools of this kind. So you're offering these folks something. In some cases, these are cold emails. In some cases, they're referral emails. I talked to so-and-so, he said you might be on the market next year and I'd love to have a conversation with you. Or if a candidate is particularly exciting, invite them to give a seminar. That's a big deal for a graduate student or postdoc to be invited to give a colloquium. And then finally, for extremely exciting candidates, we have something called the Targeted Opportunity Program, in which departments can forego for a particularly exciting candidate, particularly from an underrepresented group, departments can forego their national search and make a direct hire through a process I can talk about more if anyone is interested. Okay, so those are the reasons that you need the preparatory year, because we need time to do the strategic planning, to do the tactical planning, and then to build the candidate pool. The next thing the department is going to want to talk about is describing the position. What is it we want? What are our goals for this position? And so the department works on, they get a rubric, and it's 4 categories. Essential criteria. So an example of an essential criteria might be the job is in the anthropology department. So PhD in anthropology might be where the department starts. But then I will, challenge isn't quite the right word, but invite them to think, okay, if you put PhD in anthropology, what interdisciplinary fields are you excluding? And might someone in those interdisciplinary fields fill this role equally well as someone with a PhD in anthropology? So it's a very different job ad if it says PhD in anthropology versus PhD in anthropology and closely related fields. Okay, so, but I don't have a PhD in anthropology. I have a PhD in physics. So I don't meet that essential criteria. I don't have, okay. Then highly desirable criteria. And so this, for instance, an essential criteria might be a PhD in anthropology or closely related field and able to teach the core courses in anthropology. So if they've been trained in a closely related field, they still need to be able to teach the core courses in anthropology. Then a highly desirable criteria might be, I'm going to switch to a different discipline in psychology, might be they can teach our statistics course. It's not essential that they do that because we do have other people on the faculty who can do it, but we'd like someone who could rotate into that course. So if we got a great candidate and they weren't prepared to teach statistics, maybe we would say that will be part of your job 3 to 5 years from now. And so we'll have you co-teach that with someone, say in year 3, so that you can do it. You can rotate in year 5. So that highly desirable, they come in already able to teach that course, but we have a way of integrating them into that course if they don't come with the prior skill. Okay. This is an important category, hidden or unspoken criteria. So let me give you an example here. Many of our departments in the past were at a small liberal arts college. So they would look at a file and they would say, oh, look, this person went to Amherst. That's another small liberal arts college like us. They'll hit the ground running. Okay, what's buried in they'll hit the ground running is, oh, great. They know they're familiar with colleges like this. I won't have to mentor them. Okay, so it's really a less work for me. And we don't want to put our work, we don't want to burden the candidates with what should be our work. So having familiarity with a small liberal arts college, you may be wanting to use that as a criteria, but the group as a whole has decided that that shouldn't be a criteria. So you have to, or they haven't talked about it. If you're going to use it as a criteria, you have to say it out loud at this point and say, I think it would be great to get someone from a small liberal arts college. I think that's desirable. And then the group has to talk it out. And if they decide, no, we're trying to find someone who complements us, and it's more likely that that person might have gone to Cal State Northridge as an undergraduate and Berkeley as a graduate student, they'll be great. They could be great here, but they wouldn't have any prior familiarity with liberal arts colleges. And that's okay because we've already set up a mentoring program for them. Okay, so then that goes into non-criterion. We've explicitly excluded it as a criterion. Okay, so the essential criteria and the highly desirable, ultimately, those are the only things by which the candidate will be evaluated. So what I tell the departments is have a meeting, get your criteria out there, talk through what are essential criteria, highly desirable, talk through your hidden criteria, and then state explicitly your non-criteria, particularly things that you have habitually used in the past that we are agreeing not to use anymore. Okay, so now we move on to the public phase. The public phase of the search starts the day that the job ad goes out into the world. So first of all, use your criteria that you've developed to craft the job ad and stay as broad as possible. Don't list every little thing you would love this candidate to have, because the research shows that women and people of color are much more likely to exclude themselves based on a long list of attributes that you would prefer versus particularly white male candidates who have the confidence to say, okay, there's a list of 10 things here. I do 6 of them. That makes me fantastic. Okay. Don't expect the candidates to read your minds. So what we tend to do is we give candidates credit for reading our minds. That is, they add things to their cover letters and CVs that they have inside information that those things would be useful for us to have, but we haven't explicitly asked for them. So a candidate from a less well-resourced graduate program may not have or some people have parents that were academics. There are all kinds of ways that people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds and higher educational families know these sort of inside tricks. So if there's something you want from the candidates in the cover letter or CV, ask for it explicitly. And if you don't ask for it explicitly, don't ding candidates for not having included it. And request evidence for the candidate's knowledge and skill in inclusive pedagogical practice and in cultural fluency. And I'm sorry, I didn't define cultural fluency. That's the ability to understand your own contingent identities, your race, your gender, your socioeconomic background, your educational level, your gender identity, etc. To understand your own contingent identities and how living in your body and mind as you do, how your own contingent identities affect your interactions with others, and that you work from a perspective of cultural humility. What can I learn from this person that complements me along so many axes of identity, rather than my perspective is universal, and so I don't understand what you're saying. Okay, so next, and this, by the way, everything that I've done so far, all of this has to happen before anyone opens files, because once we open files, we all fall in love with our lunch buddies. And so whatever we've decided to do together, oh, I want to go back, sorry, before the public face, back here to the criterion. And actually, I don't need to go back, sorry to jump around. Okay, so at some point we're going to, and so we both in the preparatory year and in the public phase, we talk about implicit bias and their effects on decision making. So what I want to say about implicit biases are that they're human. We all have them and we all act upon them continually. So just by way of, and so implicit biases, they're not character flaws. They are, every human has them. And we're not going to overcome our implicit biases in time for this search. We may be working on that, but we're not going to do it. So instead, we want to come to agreement on how we're going to conduct the search to mitigate the effect of our implicit biases on our decision making, not to cure them, and certainly not to blame one another for having them. Okay, so how do we do that? So first, we discuss common biases that affect decisions in faculty searches. And again, I don't have time to go into them in this presentation, but I'm happy to, as I said, talk to anyone later about them. And then mitigate, and then we think of that we're going to mitigate the effects of these biases in our decision making using cooperative strategies. That is, we're going to agree on strategies that help us mitigate bias. When we agree to use the strategies, we agree to use the strategies we develop and hold each other to that agreement. So what's the strategy? So we have criterion. That's the first thing. We've already done an important part of building the strategy to mitigate implicit bias in our decision making. Now that we have our criterion, we're going to build an evidence rubric for each criterion for each candidate. So we say, we have a criterion. So ability to teach the core courses in anthropology, that's the criterion. What would be evidence? Well, one would be that they have successfully taught the core courses in anthropology somewhere else. Okay, two would be they TA'd, they were a graduate TA in the core courses in anthropology 3 times at their former institution. A weaker evidence, they took the core courses at the graduate level and did well in them, and they TA'd some other course. Okay, so you could say, what's the evidence that they could be successful teaching our core courses? So you decide what constitutes evidence that the candidate meets or does not meet this criteria. And then the entire rest of the search is really 2 things: wooing the candidates, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then collecting evidence that candidates do or do not meet each criteria. The reason this is so important is that as soon as we open a file, we immediately have an impression, positive or negative. It's not possible to just be neutral about a file. Or if you are completely neutral, that's probably negative, okay? We have a positive or negative experience of that file. That first impression is often there are implicit biases in that first reaction that we have to the file. But whatever it is, suppose it's positive, then we look through the file for evidence that supports our initial impression. So if we originally had a positive experience of the file, we'll look for evidence that reinforces that positive experience. If we had a negative experience of that file, we'll look for evidence that reinforces that negative experience. So what the rubric helps us do is say, this candidate that I had such a positive experience of their file when I first read it. Okay, why? Well, because they meet criterion, because they're really strong in criterion 1, and they're really strong in criterion 4, and they're really strong in criterion 7. But now, this is what we didn't do before. I have to admit, they're not strong in 2, 5, and 8. Okay, so even the candidates that we're most excited about, they don't meet all the criteria at the highest level. There's no human being that does that. So we're being honest about what it is the candidates bring and what it is the candidates do. There's not evidence that they bring it. Okay, so sorry. So now we're at the application stage. And this is important that we look everywhere in the file for evidence of a candidate meeting our criterion. Let me give you an example. I was a part of a group of small liberal arts colleges that were going to research-intensive universities to do workshops on teaching at small liberal arts colleges. And we were doing this in order to have face time with possible candidates for our future jobs. So one of the things I learned from the students was, in some cases, I've had colleagues that had looked at a cover letter and say, this person doesn't mention teaching. We're at a teaching intensive institution. So this person doesn't mention teaching anywhere in their cover letter. So I'm throwing out this file. They're not really interested in teaching. But what I learned from going to the research intensive universities was that many students are told by their advisors, don't mention teaching in your cover letter because it makes you not look serious as a scholar. So the candidate is getting bad advice from their advisor, and we're throwing out their file because of that bad advice, rather than anything that actually does or doesn't meet our criterion. So maybe they don't mention teaching in their cover letter, but when you look in their CV, they were teaching assistants 3 times more often than they needed to be. They were the head TA. They got rave reviews as a teaching assistant. They worked in the prison to college pipeline program. That's a person who's interested in teaching, whether or not they mention it in their cover letter. Okay, so wherever the evidence is, if you have the evidence, you have the evidence. They don't have to organize it exactly the way you would have liked. Okay, and then it's important to ask, given what we asked for in the job ad, what can't we know at this stage? And therefore, what do we need to find out at the next stage? Now that we're in the age of Zoom, preliminary interviews are an incredibly efficient way to find out a lot about a candidate for very little expense in both time and money. So you can have a sub panel of 3 from your search committee do Zoom interviews. And rather than in the old days when we could maybe talk to 8 people at a conference, now you can have Zoom with 15 easily. So what can't we know at this stage? What do we need to find out at the next stage? As I said before, don't privilege candidates for reading your minds. It's great if they added more information than you asked for, but you can't give them a leg up because they did that. Okay, and move intriguing candidates to the next stage where you can find out these things that you can't know at this stage. As I said, for very little cost in either treasure or time. Okay, so now we're in the preliminary interview stage. We found our intriguing candidates that complement our existing skills along as many axes as possible. Okay, what are we doing in the preliminary interview stage? Again, the whole point of the preliminary interview stage is to gather more evidence that the candidates do or do not meet the criterion. So, time is precious. Build each interview question to gain additional evidence that you need for each candidate. So what is it we need after the paper application? And then remember, if you can see them, they can see you. So at this point, as soon as you're on screen with this candidate, your panel is incredibly excited. We've read your application. We're really excited about you and your work. We want to learn more. So because one of these people that you're interviewing is actually going to be the person to whom you make the job offer. And that person's likely to have other job offers. And if you want them to take your offer, they should know from this stage forward that you are really excited about them. Okay. And then the final interview stage, again, so this is when you're inviting candidates to campus. Use every moment of that candidate's time is precious, and you want to treat it that way. So what is a traditional route might be, oh, the candidate comes to campus and we have them spend a half hour with each faculty member in the department. Well, if you're going to do that, don't have open-ended conversations. That's just a channel for unconscious biases to come in. Oh, love this guy. We had a great chat. He plays squash too. You don't want any of that going on. So assign every interviewer a question for which you still need evidence. So you ask your colleague, you say, Janet, we need to know whether this person will be enthusiastic about and skilled in teaching the core courses. You teach one of the core courses. Please talk to the candidate about the core course. Describe it to them and ask them how they would see themselves as adding to it. Okay, everybody has an assignment. And that way the candidate's not endlessly repeating themselves all day and come in and go, so tell me about your research. So tell me why you want to come to read. The candidate doesn't want to answer that question 10 times. And then describe in detail how you intend to support your new colleague. You've done that work, and you've done that work, so share it with the candidate. And finally, wherever your campus is located, talk up your town. So for instance, I'm in Portland, Oregon, and some news media have said that Portland, Oregon is the whitest large city in the country. Personally, I don't believe this because I've been to Salt Lake City and I've been to Burlington, Vermont. But nonetheless, it's out there. And so when candidates, for instance, African-American candidates come to the campus, I say, Portland has a small but vibrant African-American community. And that's completely true. Okay, so onward to final deliberations. So this is the moment where people tend to go back to their safe place, and their safe place is a clone of them or someone else in the department or some conglomeration of attributes of people in the department. So you have to go back and say, remember, stay true to your goal to hire a colleague who's well-trained, promising as a teacher scholar, enthusiastic about working in your setting, and because you've given them the message that even though they're not from a setting exactly like this, you're going to have their backs in helping them acclimate to this setting, to your setting. And then that they bring attributes that diversify and complement the department, program, and college's existing strengths along as many axes as possible. Okay, so that's what we do. And the question is, does it work? So what we do in terms of these statistics is we started these programs in 2011. Not all of this was in place in 2011 by any means. We have built it up over time, but every year we go up a year and back a year. And so now we're looking at a decade. In the decade before we started these hiring protocols, 17% of hires were either BIPOC and or women non-binary in STEM disciplines. In the decade since we started these hiring protocols, 64% of our hires are BIPOC and or women or non-binary in STEM. And I should have disaggregated BIPOC. It's quite high. It's not that this is overwhelmed by women in STEM. And we've actually hired a lot of women of color in our STEM disciplines. So that is the end of my my presentation. Let me stop sharing my screen here. Okay. So Alexis, is it possible? Oh, I see there's some things in the chat.
Well, yes, there's some questions we have. Thank you so much. That was really informative. I thought it was super useful, and just in general for any kinds of things where you want to actually do really decent diversity work. Faculty hiring, but this is really important for lots of different things. So our first question is, how much support is given or required for the institution on the whole for things like mentoring, professional development, and so on?
Mm-hmm. So our philosophy is that if we're going to hire someone into a position, and we are really excited about our hires. So when we actually hire someone, like almost literally the people in the department are like, oh, you know, they're coming. We're so excited. They accepted the job. And so it's like, okay, we have all this excitement about our new hire. How are we going to support them? So we have quite strong startup funds for professors, including startup funds in disciplines like English and anthropology, not just for the scientists who need labs. And then there are professional opportunities for travel to conferences and for various kinds of collaboration. So one thing we're very aware of, we're a small college, and so no one has someone in their subdiscipline in their department. Everybody's doing something different. And so it's really important for people to have collaborations with outside researchers. And so we support travel, either people going to conferences or to work with their collaborators, or people coming in. And we offer, particularly for BIPOC and other, you know, it could be for gender minorities, whatever, we offer people opportunities to be part of mentoring communities that are specific to that identity or cultural affinity outside of the university.
Great, thanks. That was useful. And then there's another question about how do you work with the diversity office in the search process to sort of critique the criteria, or I guess to just, you know, overall facilitate anything with this?
Right. Okay. So I should have said this at the beginning. So I'm a professor of physics, but from 2014 to 2022, I served as the Dean for Institutional Diversity. So that's the Chief Diversity Officer of the college. And so as we were developing this, I worked directly with departments. So in the early years, before the 2-year process was required by the college, I started by working with departments that really were already wanting to do this work. So it just said, hey, I see you have a retirement coming up in a year or two. How about, you know, I could come in and we could talk about strategic planning for this search, because I know you're interested in diversifying your department. And so those departments were like, yeah, that sounds great. Come talk to us. And so I really developed this program with the most willing departments. And then one of the things about this paradigm where you really, what happens in most searches is everyone has their own goals for the search. They never talk about them. And then their favorite candidate is the straw man for their goals. And then it's after, when you're deciding who to interview and who your finalists are, that's when your goals come out for the first time. And that's a terrible time for your goals to come out for the first time. So even if you weren't interested in diversity, this is a really good system to use, because what departments found out right away is that work they put in on the front end in that preparatory year, it paid off over and over again in the public phase of the search, because there were all kinds of things they weren't trying to hammer out using the candidates as straw men. They were saying, no, we've already decided what we're doing, and now who can help us do those things?
Great, thanks.
So the answer is I was very much involved with each department doing this work. Yeah.
Cool. And so the next question is, does supporting the year-round activities such as strategic planning and so on require external from the department assistance, and how much training do those taking part in the process need?
Okay, so as I said, the information that I presented to you in 45 minutes is usually done in two-hour workshops. So the first workshop is for the preparatory year. So the departments that are going to apply to do searches in the following year, because you have to apply in the year prior for a line. If you're going to apply, then the department has to come to this workshop. And it's a 2-hour workshop on the things we talked about: building a strategic plan, doing the tactical planning, building a candidate pool. So they attend that together, you know, so multiple departments will be at that workshop. But then I'll also follow up with each of the departments individually and meet with them and say, okay, how's the strategic plan coming? What's it look like? And so act as a facilitator for them not making decisions for them. I'm just acting as a facilitator of those conversations. And then also, as I said, giving them direct help in building their pool. So, okay, where might we find candidates? Then we can actually have an undergraduate scrape those websites and then give you a list of names, and you can go through that and you can go back to their websites and say, oh yeah, that person looks really interesting. I'm going to send them an email. And now you have some information about them. So you are cold emailing them, but you're saying there's something interesting about you on your website, and that's why I'm contacting you, which is what websites are for. So
Great, thanks. And I was curious, so you were talking mostly about your institutional things, multiple departments, which is fantastic. What kind of role could you imagine that we could do this workshop stuff and sort of the work you're doing at more of a broad physics, national scale type thing? Because I mean, people are always doing job searches, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's a good question. So I've been active with the American Institute of Physics I co-chaired the Team Up project, which some of your members may know about. That's an initiative to double the number of African-American students earning bachelor's degrees in physics in the next decade. And what can we do to make our department cultures welcoming and supportive of them so that they can achieve that goal? So that's a little separate plug. You can just go to the AIP website, type in Team Up, and you can download the report. So I think it's a good question. Maybe an initiative like that out of APS or AIP, where we talk about inclusive hiring practices. I do work with other institutions doing these workshops for them and helping, and then continuing to help them in any way that they find useful. But that's kind of as you say, it's not really discipline wide that way. So it's a good thought.
We should really talk about that because that would be really good. And I want to get to the last two questions. Has your model been taken up by any other institutions? You did mention that you do this at the workshop at other places, but is this sort of like a regular thing some other places are doing?
Yeah. So in particular, so the places that I've worked where they've really worked hard to adopt the core model are the College of Worcester in Ohio, and because their dean of faculty is extremely committed to this, and then Seattle University, which is obviously in Seattle. And working with Seattle University has been really great because they're a bigger institution. So Reed College is small, College of Worcester is small, but they're really taking it on across the whole university. So not only their College of Arts and Sciences, but their College of Engineering, their law school, their business school, et cetera. So those are the ones. I've given a lot of workshops, and I don't know sometimes how far it goes from there, because after I've given the workshops, that's what they've asked me to do. But those institutions I've been working with, for multiple years now, and they're really walking the walk. Yeah.
Cool, thanks. And our final question is, in your work with individual departments, did you encounter any that were not willing to adapt this new practice? And if you did, what are your best strategies for getting buy-in?
So as I said, definitely, I think the right way to begin is to work with the choir, work with those departments that really want to diversify their faculty. And for them, it's not a question of should we, but how, right? And so working with them and saying, these are the things we should do, and that's going to greatly increase our chances of having a diverse pool and therefore making a diverse hire. Okay, so then what happened was there are two committees at Reed that are involved in hiring practices. The committee that gives out lines, that's the Committee on Academic Planning. And then the committee that reviews people, so the Committee on Advancement and Tenure. So I went to those committees and I said, this is what I've been doing with these departments, and I think it would be really good for this to be a campus-wide policy. So they didn't go to they allowed me to rewrite the guidelines for searches, but instead of saying you have to do this, it said basically we consider this best practice or something like that, but it didn't say you have to do it. But to my surprise, a lot of departments read that and they just read the guidelines and they go, oh, we have to do this. So all of a sudden, instead of me chasing departments trying to get them interested, departments are calling me. It says we have to contact the Dean for Institutional Diversity and have some planning. And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, of course you do. So then a lot of departments were doing it because I don't think it was begrudgingly, but they just thought that's what they were supposed to do. And then the final departments, I'd say maybe the best answer to the question is there's often some resistance in the departments, but then the departments realized eventually that that if they're applying for a line, that finally those committees said, your application is going to be a lot stronger if you tell us what your strategy is for attracting diverse candidates into your pool. So people did it because they knew it made a stronger case for the line. And then finally, it just became, you have to do this. You know, if you're going to apply for a line, you've got to tell us that you've done your homework and that you've built your strategic plan and your tactical plan and your et cetera. So but it evolved over the years rather than, and it was interesting because who was I talking to? I was talking to somebody who, they'd kind of just plunged, they had a similar system to this, but they just plopped it into place and told the faculty they had to do it. And they had a lot of blowback and they had to back up. So I'm glad we didn't do it that. I wish it had gone faster, but I'm glad we didn't do it that way.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Changing anything is really, really hard.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We're a minute over. I'm going to stop the recording right now.
Okay, I just want to say anyone who wants to get in touch to talk more about this, my email is mjames@reed.edu. I can throw that in the chat real quick.